The gas lamps flickered against the April evening as Washington, D.C. pulsed with a joy it hadn't felt in 4 long years. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered just 5 days earlier at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War that had torn America apart. Church bells still echoed through the Capitol streets, and celebratory crowds gathered on every corner. But in the shadows of this national euphoria, a different kind of drama was about to unfold, one that would transform celebration into catastrophe in a matter of hours. Ford's Theater stood like a beacon on 10th Street, its familiar facade welcoming theatergoers to what promised to be a triumphant evening. The 3-story brick building had become Washington's premier entertainment venue, hosting everything from Shakespearean tragedies to light-hearted comedies. Tonight's offering was Our American Cousin, a popular British farce that had been delighting audiences across the nation. But this wasn't just any performance. This was a performance that would attract the most powerful man in America. President Abraham Lincoln had initially been reluctant to attend. The weight of reuniting a fractured nation pressed heavily on his shoulders, and he'd already declined several social invitations that week. His wife Mary, however, had been insistent. After years of war, grief, and the immense pressure of leadership, she believed her husband deserved an evening of simple entertainment. What's more, the newspapers had already announced the presidential party's attendance, and disappointing the public seemed unthinkable during such a momentous time in American history. The theater's owner, John T. Ford, had spared no expense in preparing for his distinguished guests. Box 5, the state box on the theater's second level, had been specially decorated with flags and bunting. A portrait of George Washington was hung prominently, and comfortable rocking chairs were arranged to give the president and his party the perfect view of the stage. The box featured 2 separate compartments connected by a doorway, providing both intimacy and grandeur befitting the leader of a reunited nation. As evening approached, the theater buzzed with anticipation. The cast of Our American Cousin prepared for what they knew would be one of their most important performances. Laura Keene, the renowned actress and theater manager starring in the production, understood the significance of entertaining a president who had just guided America through its greatest trial. The supporting players, Harry Hawk, John Diet, and the rest of the company, felt the electric atmosphere as well-dressed patrons filled the 1,700-seat venue. But not everyone gathering around Ford's Theater that evening harbored celebratory intentions. While Washington reveled in peace, a small group of Confederate sympathizers nursed their rage and plotted revenge. For them, Lincoln wasn't the great emancipator or the savior of the Union. He was a tyrant who had destroyed their way of life and trampled on what they believed were their constitutional rights. The streets around the theater filled with carriages as the fashionable elite of Washington society arrived for the evening's entertainment. Military officers still wearing their dress uniforms mingled with politicians, diplomats, and wealthy merchants. The atmosphere was festive, almost intoxicating. America had survived its greatest test, and tonight was a celebration of that survival. Inside the theater, gas lights illuminated faces filled with anticipation and joy. The orchestra tuned their instruments as patrons found their seats, many craning their necks toward the presidential box that still stood empty. Programs rustled, conversations hummed with excitement about the war's end, and the air itself seemed charged with possibility. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. As 8 p.m. approached, all eyes turned expectantly toward the theater's entrance. In just a few hours, this temple of entertainment would become the stage for one of history's most shocking crimes. The curtain was about to rise not just on Our American Cousin, but on a tragedy that would echo through the centuries, forever changing how America protected its leaders and understood the price of democracy. The clock was ticking toward 10:15 p.m., though no one in that joyous crowd could possibly imagine what that moment would bring. 3 months earlier, in the dimly lit back room of Gautier's restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue, a plot that would shake the foundations of American democracy first took shape. The conspirators didn't look like the stuff of nightmares. They appeared to be ordinary young men, the kind you might pass on any Washington street without a second glance. But beneath their unremarkable exteriors burned a fanatical devotion to the Confederate cause that would drive them to contemplate the unthinkable. John Wilkes Booth sat at the center of this deadly circle, his dark eyes blazing with the same intensity that had made him one of America's most celebrated actors. At 26, Booth possessed the kind of magnetic charisma that could fill theater seats and charm Washington's social elite. Born into theatrical royalty, his father, Junius Brutus Booth, was considered one of the finest Shakespearean actors of his generation. John Wilkes had inherited both dramatic talent and an unstable temperament that bordered on the obsessive. But Booth's greatest role wasn't being performed on any stage. In the salons and drawing rooms of Confederate sympathizers throughout Maryland and Washington, he played the part of a dedicated Southern patriot. While his brothers Edwin and Junius supported the Union cause, John Wilkes had thrown his considerable fortune and influence behind the Confederacy. He smuggled medical supplies to Southern forces, used his theatrical tours to gather intelligence, and spoke openly of his belief that Lincoln was a dictator who deserved death. The conspiracy began not as an assassination plot, but as something almost more audacious, a plan to kidnap the President of the United States. Booth had convinced himself that capturing Lincoln and spiriting him away to Richmond would force the Union to negotiate a favorable peace with the Confederacy. It was a fantasy born of desperation, but Booth's theatrical mind transformed it into what he saw as a noble cause worthy of the greatest dramatic gesture. Around Booth gathered a motley collection of Confederate agents, disaffected young men, and lost souls seeking purpose in the dying days of the rebellion. Lewis Powell, known to his conspirators as Lewis Payne, was a former Confederate soldier whose handsome features masked a capacity for shocking violence. Standing over 6 feet tall, with piercing blue eyes, Powell had deserted from the Confederate Army and drifted into Booth's orbit, drawn by promises of striking a meaningful blow against the Union. George Atzerodt represented the conspiracy's criminal element, a German immigrant carriage painter who had made his living ferrying Confederate agents and spies across the Potomac River. Atzerodt's knowledge of Washington's back alleys and river crossings made him invaluable to Booth's plans, though his nervous disposition and heavy drinking made him an unreliable partner in any enterprise requiring steady nerves. David Harold, barely 23 and possessing the mental capacity of someone much younger, served as the conspiracy's scout and guide. His intimate knowledge of Southern Maryland's roads and safe houses would prove crucial to any escape plan. Harold worshipped Booth with an almost childlike devotion, seeing in the famous actor the kind of heroic figure he'd never be himself. The conspiracy also included Samuel Arnold and Michael Oliphant, childhood friends of Booth from Baltimore who had initially joined what they believed would be a kidnapping plot. Both men possessed enough sense to grow increasingly uncomfortable as Booth's schemes became more grandiose and dangerous, but they remained entangled in a web they no longer fully understood or supported. Perhaps most tragically, the plot ensnared Mary Surratt, a 45-year-old widow who operated a boarding house on H Street where the conspirators frequently met. Whether Mary Surratt was an active participant in the conspiracy or simply an unfortunate woman caught in circumstances beyond her control would become one of the most debated questions in American legal history. Her boarding house had become a known gathering place for Confederate sympathizers, and her son John was deeply involved in Booth's schemes, but the extent of her own knowledge and participation remained murky. As winter turned to spring in 1865, the conspiracy evolved and darkened. The fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender at Appomattox shattered any remaining hope that kidnapping Lincoln could save the Confederacy. But rather than abandoning his plot, Booth transformed it into something far more sinister. If the South could not be saved, then at least its enemies could be punished. The kidnapping plot became an assassination conspiracy aimed not just at Lincoln, but at Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward as well. Booth's plan was breathtakingly ambitious in its scope, a coordinated strike designed to decapitate the Union government in a single evening. He would personally handle Lincoln. Powell would murder Seward at his home, and Atzerodt would kill Vice President Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel. The plan relied on precise timing, steady nerves, and more than a little luck. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that appealed to Booth's theatrical sensibilities, but it was also a recipe for catastrophe. By April 14th, 1865, the conspiracy had reached its deadly crescendo. The actors were in place, the stage was set, and the final, terrible performance was about to begin. Abraham Lincoln awakened on the morning of April 14th, 1865, in surprisingly good spirits. For the first time in 4 years, he had fallen asleep without the weight of active warfare pressing on his conscience. The spring sunlight streaming through the windows of the executive mansion seemed to illuminate not just the president's bedroom, but the promise of a nation finally at peace with itself. At breakfast, Lincoln appeared more relaxed than his family had seen him in months. His wife Mary later recalled how he spoke of their future with an optimism that had been absent during the dark years of war. They would return to Springfield after his presidency. He mused, perhaps travel to Europe, maybe even visit the Holy Land. The deep lines etched into his face by years of agonizing decisions seemed somehow softer in the morning light. And when he smiled, something he did more frequently that day than in months past, it reached his tired eyes. The president's schedule began early, as always, but today's appointments carried a different character. Instead of urgent war councils and desperate strategic meetings, Lincoln found himself discussing the future of a reunited America. At his regular cabinet meeting, he spoke passionately about the need for reconstruction without revenge, urging his advisors to treat the defeated South with magnanimity rather than malice. "We must bind up the nation's wounds," he told them, words that would echo through history with tragic irony. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, ever protective of Lincoln's safety, had grown increasingly concerned about threats against the president's life. The war's end had not diminished the hatred felt by Confederate sympathizers. If anything, it had concentrated their fury into something more dangerous. Stanton had repeatedly urged Lincoln to accept stronger security measures, but the president consistently resisted. He believed that in a democracy, the people's representatives must remain accessible to the people, even if that accessibility came with risks. During his afternoon appointments, Lincoln met with numerous visitors, including former slaves who had traveled to Washington to thank the president who had freed them. These encounters moved Lincoln deeply. One elderly woman, tears streaming down her face, simply said, "Thank you, Father Abraham, for giving me back my children." The president, visibly emotional, took her hands in his and assured her that her freedom was now secure by law and would never again be taken away. Around 4 o'clock, Lincoln received a message that would seal his fate, though he couldn't possibly have known it at the time. The note informed him that General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife would be unable to accompany the President and Mrs. Lincoln to Ford's Theater that evening as previously planned. Grant cited pressing business requiring him to visit his children in New Jersey, but privately, Julia Grant had expressed discomfort about spending an evening with Mary Lincoln, whose volatile temperament had become well known in Washington social circles. The Grant's cancellation created a problem of protocol and publicity. The newspapers had already announced that the victorious general would accompany the president to the theater, and disappointing the public seemed particularly unfortunate during such a celebratory time. Mary Lincoln quickly began reaching out to other potential guests, eventually securing the company of Major Henry Rathbone, a handsome young officer, and his fiancée, Clara Harris, daughter of Senator Ira Harris. As evening approached, Lincoln found himself in an unusually contemplative mood. He spent time reviewing poetry, particularly the works of Shakespeare, whose tragic heroes had always fascinated him. He read passages aloud from Macbeth, dwelling on lines about the futility of ambition and the inevitability of fate. His personal secretary, John Hay, later recalled how the president seemed almost prescient that day, as though some shadow of the future had crossed his consciousness. At dinner, the president ate heartily, another sign of his improved spirits. He joked with his son Tad, discussed plans for a family trip to Chicago, and spoke warmly of his hopes for the Republican Party's future. Mary Lincoln noticed that her husband seemed almost boyish in his enthusiasm for their theater plans, mentioning several times how much he looked forward to simply laughing at a comedy after years of bearing the nation's sorrows. The irony was heartbreaking in its completeness. On the day when Abraham Lincoln felt most optimistic about America's future, when he dared to dream of personal happiness and national healing, forces were already in motion that would deny him both. While the president enjoyed his final dinner in the executive mansion, John Wilkes Booth was making his final preparations for murder just a few miles away. Around 7:30 that evening, Lincoln donned his black suit and silk top hat, the same outfit he had worn to his second inauguration just 6 weeks earlier. He slipped his reading glasses into his pocket, along with a small penknife and a handkerchief. In his wallet, he carried a Confederate $5 bill, perhaps kept as a memento of the rebellion's end, though no one would ever know his reasons for carrying it. As the presidential carriage was prepared for the short journey to Ford's Theater, Lincoln stepped onto the White House portico and gazed up at the clear April sky. The stars were just becoming visible, and the president stood quietly for a moment, breathing in the mild evening air of a capital city finally at peace. He could not have imagined that in less than 3 hours, those same stars would shine down on a nation once again plunged into darkness, mourning the loss of the leader who had guided them through their greatest trial. The presidential carriage rolled through the gaslit streets of Washington at precisely 8:15 p.m., 30 minutes late for the scheduled 8 o'clock curtain. Inside the elegant vehicle, Abraham Lincoln sat beside his wife Mary, their hands intertwined in a rare moment of public intimacy. Across from them, Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris chatted nervously, still somewhat overwhelmed by the honor of accompanying the President and First Lady to what promised to be the social event of the season. As their carriage approached Ford's Theater, the sounds of the city seemed unusually vibrant. Crowds still celebrated in the streets. Veterans shared drinks and stories on street corners, and the general atmosphere of jubilation made the evening feel almost magical. The war was over, the Union preserved, and their beloved president was finally taking time for the simple pleasure of watching a play. Ford's Theater blazed with light as the presidential party arrived. Every gas lamp in the building had been lit for the occasion, and the theater's facade glowed like a beacon against the April night. Theater manager John T. Ford himself waited at the entrance, flanked by ushers in their finest uniforms. A small crowd had gathered on 10th Street, hoping to catch a glimpse of the president, and they erupted in cheers as Lincoln's distinctive tall frame emerged from the carriage. The president paused on the sidewalk, removing his silk hat to acknowledge the crowd's enthusiasm. His face, normally grave with the weight of office, carried a genuine smile as he waved to the gathered citizens. Mary Lincoln, resplendent in a low-cut black silk dress, took her husband's arm with obvious pride. For a moment, they looked like any prosperous couple enjoying an evening out, rather than the most powerful and embattled figures in American politics. Inside the theater, the performance of Our American Cousin had already begun, but the audience's attention was clearly divided between the stage and the still empty presidential box. The play itself was a light-hearted British comedy about an awkward American heir visiting his aristocratic English relatives, the kind of gentle satire that allowed audiences to laugh at familiar social situations without challenging anyone's sensibilities. As the presidential party made their way through the theater's lobby and up the stairs to the dress circle level, word of their arrival spread like wildfire through the building. Conversations paused, heads turned, and a palpable electricity filled the air. Laura Keene, the evening star, had been performing professionally for years, but she had never felt an audience's attention divided quite like this. The moment Lincoln appeared at the entrance to Box 5, the entire theater erupted. 1,200 patrons rose to their feet as one, applauding and cheering with genuine enthusiasm. The orchestra, catching the moment's spirit, struck up "Hail to the Chief," while the actors on stage paused their performance to acknowledge the presidential party. Lincoln stepped forward to the box's rail, bowing gracefully to acknowledge the ovation, his face glowing with obvious pleasure at the warm reception. Box 5 had been meticulously prepared for the evening. The two adjoining compartments had been opened into one larger space, furnished with a comfortable rocking chair positioned to give Lincoln the perfect view of the stage. American flags draped the box's balustrade, and a portrait of George Washington looked down benevolently from the wall. The box's door, which would later prove so crucial to the evening's events, stood slightly ajar, a decision made for comfort and air circulation that would have deadly consequences. As the play resumed, Lincoln settled into his rocking chair with obvious contentment. Mary sat close beside him, and for the first time in months, she watched her husband truly relax. His shoulders, normally rigid with tension, eased as he lost himself in the comedy's gentle humor. Major Rathbone and Miss Harris took their seats somewhat behind the President and Mrs. Lincoln, providing a measure of security while allowing the first couple their privacy. The first act proceeded smoothly, with Lincoln laughing heartily at the play's jokes and occasionally leaning over to whisper comments to his wife. The audience, while certainly aware of their distinguished guest, gradually allowed themselves to be drawn back into the performance. Laura Keene delivered her lines with particular vigor, knowing that her every gesture was being observed not just by regular theatergoers, but by the President of the United States. During the first intermission, several dignitaries approached Box 5 to pay their respects. Lincoln received them graciously, discussing everything from the war's end to the upcoming challenges of Reconstruction. His mood remained buoyant, and several visitors later remarked on how genuinely happy the President appeared. It was as though the weight of 4 years had finally lifted from his shoulders, allowing him to remember what it felt like to simply be a man enjoying an evening's entertainment. As the second act began, Lincoln became even more absorbed in the performance. The play's humor seemed to genuinely delight him, and his distinctive laugh, described by contemporaries as almost musical, could be heard clearly from the presidential box. Mary Lincoln later recalled that she had rarely seen her husband so completely at ease, so thoroughly present in a moment of simple pleasure. But while Lincoln enjoyed the comedy unfolding on stage, he remained completely unaware of the deadly drama taking shape in the theater shadows. John Wilkes Booth had entered Ford's Theater during the first act, moving through the building with the casual confidence of someone intimately familiar with its layout. As an actor, he had performed on this very stage numerous times, and every door, corridor, and staircase was as familiar to him as his own home. The second act drew toward its climactic moments, with the audience fully engaged in the performance. Lincoln continued rocking gently in his chair, his attention focused entirely on the stage, his guard completely down. In less than an hour, the laughter filling Ford's Theater would give way to screams of horror. But for now, all was joy and light. At 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth made his final preparations in the tavern next to Ford's Theater. His hands, normally steady from years of stage performance, trembled slightly as he downed a whiskey and checked his weapons one last time. The single-shot Derringer pistol felt cold and heavy in his coat pocket, while the hunting knife at his belt provided reassurance for close-quarters work. Everything he had planned, everything he believed in, came down to the next few minutes. Booth's timing had to be perfect. He knew Our American Cousin by heart, had performed in it himself on several occasions, and understood exactly when the audience's laughter would be loudest, providing cover for a gunshot. The play's third act contained a particularly amusing scene where the character Asa Trenchard would be left alone on stage, delivering a line guaranteed to provoke uproarious laughter from the audience. That moment, Booth calculated, would give him the precious seconds he needed. Inside Ford's Theater, the third act unfolded exactly as Booth had anticipated. The audience, now fully relaxed and enjoying themselves, laughed frequently at the comedy's familiar jokes. President Lincoln continued rocking gently in his chair, his long frame draped comfortably as he watched the performance with obvious pleasure. Mary Lincoln sat close beside him, occasionally placing her hand on his arm during particularly amusing moments. Major Rathbone and Clara Harris, positioned slightly behind the presidential couple, had also become absorbed in the play. The theater's atmosphere was one of complete contentment. Gaslights flickered warmly throughout the building, casting dancing shadows that seemed to pulse with the audience's collective good humor. No one noticed the dark-haired man moving purposefully through the theater's corridors, his actors' training allowing him to blend seamlessly into the building's familiar rhythms. Booth climbed the stairs to the dress circle with practiced ease, nodding politely to the few patrons he encountered in the corridors. His celebrity status granted him access to virtually any part of the theater, and his presence aroused no suspicion whatsoever. He had performed on this stage, socialized in these corridors, and charmed audiences from these very boxes. Tonight, he was simply John Wilkes Booth, famous actor, moving through his natural domain. Outside the door to the presidential box, Booth encountered his first obstacle. Charles Forbes, Lincoln's footman and bodyguard, sat in a chair positioned to monitor access to Box 5. But Forbes had been drinking during the performance, and his attention was focused more on the stage than on his security duties. When Booth approached with a calling card, claiming he had a message for the president, Forbes barely glanced up before waving the famous actor toward the box's entrance. The outer door to Box 5 opened silently under Booth's hand. Beyond it lay a small vestibule, and then the inner door that led directly into the presidential compartment. Booth paused in the vestibule, steadying his nerves and listening to the play's dialogue to time his approach perfectly. Through the inner door, he could hear Lincoln's distinctive laugh, the sound that had charmed political allies and opponents alike throughout his career. On stage, actor Harry Hawk delivered the line Booth had been waiting for. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sockdologizing old mantrap." The audience erupted in predictable laughter, their voices rising in a crescendo that would mask any other sound in the theater. Booth pushed through the inner door and stepped into Box 5. The scene before him was almost domestic in its intimacy. The President of the United States, sitting in his rocking chair, completely absorbed in a moment of simple entertainment, his wife beside him, their guests enjoying the performance behind them. For just an instant, Booth hesitated, struck perhaps by the humanity of the tableau before him. But his fanatical devotion to the Confederate cause overcame any momentary qualms. Drawing his derringer, Booth stepped forward until the pistol was less than 6 inches from the back of Lincoln's head. The president, still chuckling at the play's humor, remained completely unaware of the danger that had entered his sanctuary. At exactly 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. The small pistol's report was surprisingly loud despite the audience's laughter, a sharp crack that seemed to freeze time itself. The .44 caliber ball entered Lincoln's skull behind his left ear, tearing through his brain and lodging near his right eye. The president's body went instantly limp, his head falling forward as consciousness fled. Mary Lincoln's scream pierced the theater's atmosphere like a blade. Major Rathbone, startled from his attention to the stage, lunged toward the assassin, but Booth was ready. Drawing his knife, he slashed viciously at the young officer, opening a deep gash in Rathbone's arm that severed arteries and tendons, sending blood spraying across the box's presidential bunting. "Sic semper tyrannis," Booth shouted, "thus always to tyrants," the Virginia state motto and cry attributed to Brutus as he assassinated Julius Caesar. Vaulting over the box's balustrade, Booth intended to land gracefully on the stage 12 feet below, but his spur caught in the Treasury flag draped over the box's front. He crashed awkwardly to the stage floor, breaking a bone in his left leg with an audible snap. Despite his injury, Booth struggled to his feet, brandishing his bloody knife toward the stunned audience. "The South is avenged," he cried, his voice carrying clearly through a theater now erupting in chaos and confusion. Many in the audience initially thought the intrusion was part of the play, but the screams from Box 5 and the sight of blood quickly dispelled any such illusions. Harry Hawk stood frozen on the stage, unable to process what had just occurred. Behind him, Booth limped toward the rear exit, his theatrical training allowing him to maintain some dignity even in his desperate flight. The orchestra pit had fallen silent, musicians clutching their instruments as they tried to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before them. In Box 5, Mary Lincoln cradled her husband's head as blood soaked through her black silk dress. The president's breathing was labored and irregular, his pulse weak but still detectable. Major Rathbone, despite his severe wound, tried to maintain order, shouting for a doctor while applying pressure to his own severed arteries. The theater erupted into pandemonium. Some audience members rushed toward the exits in panic, while others surged toward the stage, demanding answers, vengeance, or simply trying to help. Women fainted, men cursed and shouted, and the civilized evening's entertainment dissolved into primal chaos. Dr. Charles Leal, a young army surgeon attending the play, fought his way through the crowd and up to Box 5. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The President of the United States, the man who had preserved the Union and freed 4 million slaves, dying from an assassin's bullet, his lifeblood pooling on the floor of a theater that moments before had echoed with laughter. The shot that had taken less than a second to fire would reverberate through American history for generations to come. Dr. Charles Leal knelt beside the dying president in the blood-soaked presidential box, his young hands trembling as he examined the catastrophic wound. At 23, Leal had seen battlefield injuries during his service with the Union Army, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Holding the life of Abraham Lincoln in his hands while 1,200 people waited in agonized silence below. The bullet had entered behind Lincoln's left ear and traversed his brain, destroying vital centers that controlled breathing and consciousness. Blood and brain matter stained the president's collar and the ornate upholstery of his rocking chair. Leal's fingers found a weak, irregular pulse, but Lincoln's breathing had become the labored, rattling sound that medical professionals recognized as the harbinger of death. "He cannot recover," Leal whispered to Dr. Albert King, who had also reached the box. "The wound is mortal." But even as he pronounced this devastating diagnosis, the young physician refused to abandon hope entirely. If Lincoln could not be saved, perhaps his final hours could be made more comfortable, more dignified than dying in a theater box while chaos reigned below. Mary Lincoln's anguished sobs filled the small space as she clutched at her husband's lifeless hand. Her black silk dress, chosen so carefully for an evening of celebration, was now soaked with blood, a macabre transformation that would haunt witnesses for decades. "Is he dead?" she kept asking, her voice breaking with each repetition. "Oh, is my dear husband dead?" Dr. Leal made the crucial decision that would define Lincoln's final hours. The president could not be moved back to the White House. The carriage ride would likely kill him before they reached Pennsylvania Avenue. Instead, he needed to be taken to the nearest suitable location where he could die with whatever dignity remained possible. Across 10th Street, a modest boarding house offered the only realistic alternative. The task of moving Lincoln from Box 5 to the street required careful coordination and considerable physical strength. The president's tall frame, 6 feet 4 inches of dead weight, had to be carried through the theater's narrow corridors while panicked crowds still milled about in confusion. Dr. Leal recruited several soldiers from the audience to serve as pallbearers, and together they began the agonizing journey from the scene of the crime to what would become Lincoln's deathbed. The sight of the president being carried through Ford's Theater in the arms of uniformed soldiers created a tableau of heartbreaking poignancy. Lincoln's great head lolled backward, his distinctive beard now matted with blood, his usually animated features slack and lifeless. The crowds parted reverently as the impromptu funeral procession made its way toward the theater's exit, women weeping openly and men removing their hats in spontaneous tribute. Outside on 10th Street, the April night had turned cool and a light rain had begun to fall. The drops mixed with tears on countless faces as word of the assassination spread throughout the surrounding blocks. Soldiers, many of them veterans of battles across Virginia and beyond, wept openly as they witnessed their commander-in-chief being carried like a wounded comrade from the field of his final battle. The boarding house of William and Anna Peterson stood directly across from Ford's Theater, its 3-story brick facade offering sanctuary in the midst of chaos. Henry Safford, a War Department employee who rented a room in the building, stood on the front steps holding a lantern and calling out, "Bring him in here." Bring him in here. The simple act would make the Peterson House forever synonymous with one of American history's most tragic nights. The narrow hallway of the boarding house barely accommodated the men carrying Lincoln's unconscious form. They maneuvered carefully up a short flight of stairs to the first-floor rear bedroom rented by William T. Clark, a Union soldier currently away on duty. The room was small and simply furnished. A single bed, a washstand, a few chairs, and little else. It was hardly the setting anyone would have chosen for the death of a president, yet it would serve as the stage for Lincoln's final act. The bed proved too short for Lincoln's extraordinary height. Dr. Leal and his assistants were forced to place the president diagonally across the mattress, his long legs extending beyond its foot. It was an undignified position for such a dignified man, but practical necessity trumped ceremonial considerations. Every minute counted now, and comfort mattered more than protocol. As Dr. Leal continued his examination in the boarding house's dim gaslight, the full extent of the president's injuries became heartbreakingly clear. The bullet had not only destroyed brain tissue, but had also caused severe swelling that was gradually shutting down Lincoln's remaining bodily functions. His breathing grew increasingly labored, punctuated by long, terrifying pauses that made observers wonder if each breath might be his last. Word of the assassination spread through Washington with unprecedented speed. Telegraph operators transmitted the shocking news across the nation, while messengers on horseback carried updates to government officials throughout the capital. Within hours, crowds began gathering outside the Peterson House, their faces illuminated by torchlight as they maintained a vigil for their dying leader. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived at the boarding house shortly after midnight, his normally composed demeanor shattered by grief and rage. Behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, Stanton's eyes blazed with fury at the security failure that had allowed this catastrophe to occur. Yet his first concern was ensuring that Lincoln's final hours proceeded with appropriate dignity and that the government continued to function despite the crisis. Mary Lincoln's emotional state deteriorated throughout the night. She alternated between periods of hysterical sobbing and unnatural calm, occasionally demanding to see her husband, then collapsing in grief when confronted with his condition. Her cries of anguish echoed through the boarding house, adding another layer of tragedy to an already unbearable situation. As dawn approached, Lincoln's breathing became increasingly irregular. Dr. Leal never left the president's side, monitoring his pulse and trying to ensure his comfort during the final hours. The room filled with government officials, family friends, and clergy, all maintaining their own vigil as the man who had preserved the Union slipped slowly toward eternity. The great heart that had carried the nation through its darkest hour was finally failing, and with each labored breath, America itself seemed to be dying in that cramped boarding house room across from Ford's Theater. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln drew his final breath in the small back bedroom of the Peterson House. Dr. Leal gently closed the president's eyes as Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, tears streaming down his normally stern face, whispered the words that would echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. But even as the nation began to absorb the magnitude of its loss, a different kind of drama was unfolding across the American landscape. John Wilkes Booth had vanished into the Maryland countryside, launching what would become the largest manhunt in United States history. By dawn on April 15th, over 10,000 federal troops, detectives, and local law enforcement officers were scouring the region between Washington and the Potomac River, determined to bring Lincoln's assassin to justice. The scope of the search reflected both the crimes in Normandy and the government's desperate need to demonstrate that no one, no matter how famous, clever, or well-connected, could murder the president and escape punishment. Secretary Stanton, now effectively running the country in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's death, transformed the War Department into a command center for the most intensive criminal investigation America had ever witnessed. Booth's escape from Ford's Theater had been both audacious and surprisingly well-planned. Despite his broken leg, He had managed to reach the alley behind the theater where David Harold waited with horses. Together, the assassin and his young accomplice had ridden through Washington's dark streets, past sentries and checkpoints that should have stopped them, but were caught completely off guard by the evening's unprecedented events. Their first destination was the tavern of Mary Surratt in Surrattsville, Maryland, about 15 miles southeast of Washington. Here, Booth and Harold retrieved weapons and supplies that had been cached weeks earlier as part of their original kidnapping plot. John Lloyd, the tavern's tenant, later recalled how Booth appeared to be in considerable pain from his injury, clutching his leg and requiring assistance to dismount from his horse. From Surrattsville, the fugitives traveled to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Southern Maryland physician who had previously met Booth through mutual acquaintances. Dr. Mudd set Booth's fractured leg and provided the assassin with a pair of crutches, actions that would later make him a target of the government's investigation. Whether Mudd was an innocent physician treating an injured patient or a co-conspirator aiding Booth's escape will become one of the manhunt's most controversial questions. Meanwhile, in Washington, the investigation was uncovering the assassination plot's broader scope. Lewis Powell's savage attack on Secretary of State William Seward had failed to kill its target, but left the secretary grievously wounded and fighting for his life. George Atzerott's assigned mission to murder Vice President Andrew Johnson had collapsed entirely when the German immigrant lost his nerve and spent the evening drinking in a hotel bar instead of carrying out his deadly assignment. The failure of these parallel attacks meant that Booth's grand plan to decapitate the Union government had only partially succeeded. Lincoln was dead, but the constitutional order had survived, and now the full weight of federal authority was focused on capturing those responsible. Reward posters appeared throughout Maryland and Virginia, offering $50,000 for Booth's capture, an astronomical sum that transformed every citizen into a potential bounty hunter. The manhunt's intensity reflected deep fears about the assassination's broader implications. Was Booth part of a larger Confederate conspiracy? Had Jefferson Davis or other rebel leaders ordered Lincoln's death? These questions tormented investigators and government officials alike, driving them to pursue even the most tenuous leads with relentless determination. Detective Lafayette Baker, chief of the National Detective Police, coordinated much of the search effort. Baker was a controversial figure, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to use questionable methods to achieve results. But his network of informants and agents made him invaluable during the crisis. Under his direction, suspected Confederate sympathizers throughout Maryland found themselves under surveillance or arrest as the government cast an increasingly wide net in its search for conspirators. Booth and Harold, meanwhile, were discovering that their carefully planned escape route was fraught with unexpected dangers. Southern Maryland, which they had expected to welcome them as Confederate heroes, proved surprisingly hostile to their presence. Many residents, exhausted by 4 years of war and eager to rebuild their lives, wanted nothing to do with fugitives who had murdered the president. The very people Booth expected to shelter him as a patriot instead viewed him as a dangerous criminal who had brought unwanted attention to their community. The fugitives spent several days hiding in the dense pine thickets of Zacchaeus Swamp, a vast wetland that covered much of Charles County, Maryland. Here, supplied occasionally by Confederate sympathizers like Thomas Jones, Booth and Harold waited for an opportunity to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. But federal patrols had sealed off most river crossings, and Union gunboats patrolled the waterway constantly, making escape increasingly unlikely. Booth's physical condition deteriorated steadily during this period. His broken leg caused constant pain. Infection was setting in around the fracture site, and the stress of being hunted was taking a psychological toll. The theatrical egotist who had expected to be hailed as a Southern hero instead found himself trapped in a swamp. Dependent on the charity of reluctant allies, his grand gesture degenerating into a desperate flight from justice. As the manhunt entered its second week, the pressure on anyone suspected of involvement became crushing. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerott, and David Harold had all been arrested, along with dozens of other individuals with even the most tangential connections to the conspiracy. The government's message was clear. Anyone who had aided or abetted Lincoln's assassination would face the full consequences of their actions. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The net was closing around John Wilkes Booth, but the most dramatic moments of the manhunt were yet to come. Somewhere in the Virginia countryside, the man who had changed American history forever was about to discover that there would be no escape from the consequences of that single, terrible shot fired in Ford's Theater. The arrest of Mary Surratt on April 17, 1865, marked the moment when the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge from the shadows. Federal agents surrounded her H Street boarding house at midnight, their lanterns casting eerie shadows as they searched every room, closet, and hiding place for evidence of treason. What they discovered would weave a web of circumstantial evidence that would ultimately send 4 people to the gallows and 4 others to prison. Mary Surratt presented investigators with their most complex puzzle. A 45-year-old Catholic widow, she appeared to be nothing more than a genteel woman struggling to maintain respectability while operating a boarding house in wartime Washington. Yet her establishment had become the unofficial headquarters for Confederate sympathizers, spies, and ultimately Lincoln's assassins. The question that would torment prosecutors and historians alike was simple but crucial. Was she an active conspirator or merely an unfortunate woman caught in circumstances beyond her control? The evidence against Surratt was largely circumstantial but deeply troubling. The conspirators had met regularly in her boarding house. Her son John was intimately involved in Booth's schemes, and witnesses placed her in suspicious meetings with various plotters. Most damaging of all, on the very day of Lincoln's assassination, she had traveled to her tavern in Maryland, ostensibly on business, but arriving at precisely the right time to ensure that weapons and supplies were ready for Booth's escape. Lewis Powell's capture proved even more dramatic and incriminating. On the night of April 17th, as federal agents questioned Mary Surratt in her boarding house, Powell appeared at her front door, claiming to be a laborer she had hired to dig a gutter. His timing could not have been more suspicious, and his appearance, muddy, disheveled, and clearly having slept rough for several days, contradicted his story. When agents discovered a pickaxe in his possession along with no tools suitable for digging, Powell's weak cover story collapsed entirely. Under interrogation, Powell initially maintained his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Secretary of State William Seward's household staff identified him positively as the man who had brutally attacked their employer. The knife wounds Seward had suffered matched perfectly with the weapon found in Powell's possession, and his intimate knowledge of the Seward house's layout could only have come from careful surveillance. Perhaps most chilling was Powell's complete lack of remorse for his actions. When confronted with the severity of Seward's injuries, Powell showed no emotion whatsoever. He had entered the secretary's bedroom intent on murder, and only the steel brace Seward wore to support his jaw, broken in a recent carriage accident, had deflected Powell's knife blade enough to save the secretary's life. The assassin's cold-blooded demeanor convinced investigators that they were dealing with someone capable of extreme violence in service of his political beliefs. George Atzerott's arrest revealed the conspiracy's third prong and perhaps its weakest link. The German immigrant carriage painter had completely lost his nerve on the night of the assassination, abandoning his mission to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and instead spending the evening drinking heavily at the Kirkwood House Hotel bar. His failure to carry out his assignment may have saved Johnson's life, but it also left Atzerodt with no alibi and plenty of evidence linking him to the plot. When federal agents searched Atzerott's room at the Kirkwood House, they discovered a loaded revolver, a large knife, and a bank book belonging to John Wilkes Booth, damning evidence that Atzerodt could not explain away. Under questioning, he proved to be the most talkative of the conspirators, providing details about the plot's evolution from kidnapping to assassination. His testimony revealed how Booth had gradually drawn his accomplices deeper into the conspiracy, often without fully explaining the ultimate goals. David Harold's capture would come later, but his role in the conspiracy was already clear to investigators. As Booth's guide and companion, the young man had intimate knowledge of Southern Maryland's roads, safe houses, and Confederate sympathizers. His boyish appearance and limited intelligence made him seem almost harmless, but his unwavering devotion to Booth had made him an essential part of the assassination plot. The investigation also ensnared several peripheral figures whose exact level of involvement remained debatable. Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had treated Booth's broken leg, insisted he was simply fulfilling his medical oath by treating an injured patient. However, his previous meetings with Booth and his failure to immediately report treating the fugitive made him suspect in investigators' eyes. Samuel Arnold and Michael Oliphant, Booth's childhood friend from Baltimore, found themselves arrested despite having withdrawn from the conspiracy weeks before the assassination. Their early involvement in Booth's kidnapping schemes and their continued correspondence with the actor made them targets of the government's increasingly broad investigation. The interrogations revealed fascinating details about the conspiracy's psychology and internal dynamics. Booth had clearly been the dominant personality, using his fame, charisma, and financial resources to recruit and maintain his band of followers. Each conspirator had been motivated by different factors: Powell by violent Confederate loyalty, Atzerodt by money and excitement, Harold by hero worship, and the others by varying combinations of political conviction and personal loyalty to Booth. What emerged was a portrait of a conspiracy that was simultaneously sophisticated and amateurish. Booth's theatrical background had given him a flair for dramatic planning and timing, but his network of accomplices included several individuals whose commitment and competence were questionable. The plot's success in killing Lincoln owed as much to luck and inadequate security as it did to careful planning. The prisoners were held under harsh conditions at the Washington Arsenal, their cells barely large enough to accommodate a bed and washstand. They were kept in isolation, denied visitors, and required to wear heavy canvas hoods that covered their entire heads, except for small holes for eating and breathing. These hoods, designed to prevent the prisoners from communicating with each other or planning escapes, became symbols of the government's determination to ensure that no detail of the conspiracy remained hidden. As the investigation continued, public anger toward the conspirators reached fever pitch. Newspapers published detailed accounts of their interrogations. Editorial writers demanded swift justice, and crowds gathered outside the arsenal hoping to glimpse the individuals who had participated in their beloved president's murder. The atmosphere in Washington was charged with grief, rage, and a desperate desire for retribution. Secretary of War Stanton, now effectively running the country during the transition to Andrew Johnson's presidency, faced a critical decision about how to prosecute the conspirators. The evidence was strong, but largely circumstantial. The public demanded swift justice, and the legal precedents for trying presidential assassins were virtually non-existent. The stage was set for a trial that would test the limits of American justice and raise questions that would echo through the legal system for generations to come. On May 1, 1865, President Andrew Johnson made a decision that would forever alter the course of American military justice. Rather than allowing the Lincoln assassination conspirators to face trial in civilian courts, Johnson authorized their prosecution before a military commission, a decision that sparked immediate controversy and would be debated by legal scholars for generations. The 9 military officers who would serve as judges faced an unprecedented challenge: how to balance the nation's demand for swift retribution with the fundamental principles of American jurisprudence. The military tribunal convened in a stifling courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Washington Arsenal, its windows facing the Potomac River where Union gunboats still patrolled for Confederate agents. The room itself seemed designed to emphasize the gravity of the proceedings: stark white walls, simple wooden benches for spectators, and a raised platform where the 9 uniformed judges sat in solemn judgment. The 8 defendants occupied a wooden dock along one wall, their wrists and ankles shackled, their faces pale from weeks of confinement in the arsenal's underground cells. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt served as chief prosecutor, bringing to the case both legal brilliance in an almost fanatical determination to prove that the assassination was part of a vast Confederate conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of the rebel government. Holt's opening statement painted a picture of treason so comprehensive that it threatened the very foundations of American democracy. According to his theory, Booth and his accomplices were merely the visible instruments of a plot orchestrated by Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders as a desperate last gamble to reverse their military defeat. The evidence Holt presented was both compelling and troubling. Witnesses testified about suspicious meetings between the conspirators. Confederate agents described the rebel government's willingness to use assassination as a weapon, and documents suggested financial connections between Southern leaders and Booth's network. Yet much of this evidence was circumstantial, and some witnesses appeared to have been coached or incentivized to provide testimony favorable to the prosecution's conspiracy theory. Mary Surratt's case proved the most controversial and heart-wrenching aspect of the entire trial. Her defense attorney, Reverdy Johnson, argued passionately that she was nothing more than an innocent boarding house keeper who had been caught up in events beyond her understanding or control. The evidence against her consisted primarily of her son John's involvement in the plot, suspicious meetings at her boarding house, and her fateful trip to Maryland on the day of the assassination. The prosecution painted a different picture entirely. They presented Mary Surratt as the conspiracy's den mother, a woman who had knowingly provided sanctuary and support for Lincoln's assassins. Witnesses testified that she had been present during planning meetings, had passed messages between conspirators, and had made arrangements that facilitated Booth's escape. Most damaging of all was Lewis Powell's appearance at her door on the very night of her arrest, claiming to be a worker she had hired, a coincidence the prosecution argued was simply too convenient to be believed. Lewis Powell himself presented a study in contradictions that fascinated and horrified observers. The handsome young man who sat quietly in the defendant's dock bore little resemblance to the savage killer who had nearly murdered Secretary Seward. During the trial, Powell maintained an almost supernatural calm, showing no emotion even when confronted with graphic testimony about his brutal attack. His attorney argued that Powell was a simple-minded tool manipulated by more sophisticated conspirators, but his cold demeanor suggested a capacity for violence that chilled everyone in the courtroom. George Atzerott's defense centered on his failure to carry out his assigned mission. His attorneys argued that his decision to abandon the plot to kill Vice President Johnson proved that he had withdrawn from the conspiracy at the crucial moment. However, the prosecution countered that Atzerott's failure was due to cowardice rather than conscience, and that his possession of weapons and detailed knowledge of the plot made him equally culpable regardless of his ultimate actions. David Harold's youth and apparent limited intelligence became central to his defense strategy. His attorneys portrayed him as little more than a child who had been manipulated by the charismatic Booth and is serving as a guide and companion. The prosecution, however, emphasized Harold's crucial role in Booth's escape and his intimate knowledge of the conspiracy's details, arguing that his youth did not absolve him of responsibility for his treasonous actions. Dr. Samuel Mudd's case highlighted the complex moral questions surrounding medical ethics during wartime. His attorneys argued that he had simply fulfilled his Hippocratic oath by treating an injured patient, regardless of that patient's identity or crimes. The prosecution countered that Mudd's previous acquaintance with Booth, his failure to immediately report treating the fugitive, and his suspicious behavior during questioning proved his active participation in the conspiracy. The trial proceedings were conducted under extraordinary security measures that reflected both the government's fear of rescue attempts and the intense public interest in the case. Spectators were searched before entering the courtroom. Military guards were posted throughout the building, and the defendants were transported to and from their cells under heavy escort. The atmosphere was more reminiscent of a wartime council of war than a traditional American criminal trial. Public opinion strongly favored conviction for all defendants, but legal observers expressed growing concern about the military commission's procedures and jurisdiction. The defendants were denied several rights that would have been guaranteed in civilian court, including the right to cross-examine certain witnesses and access to evidence that might have supported their defense. Critics argued that the military tribunal was designed to ensure convictions rather than determine guilt or innocence fairly. As testimony concluded in late June, the nation held its breath waiting for verdicts that would determine not just the fate of 8 individuals, but the precedent for how America would handle future crimes against its highest officials. The commissioners retired to deliberate on questions that went to the heart of American justice. Was this trial about determining individual guilt, or was it about national healing through retribution? Could justice be achieved through military proceedings, or did the Constitution require civilian trials, even for the most heinous crimes? The answers would come in early July, but they would satisfy neither the demand for perfect justice nor the desire for complete closure. Instead, they would create new controversies that would echo through American legal and political discourse for decades to come. The verdict was approaching, and with it, a reckoning that would test the very soul of American jurisprudence. On July 7th, 1865, at 1:15 p.m., the military commissioners delivered their verdicts in the sweltering heat of the Washington Arsenal courtroom. The 9 officers had deliberated for 3 days, their decisions sealed until this moment when they would determine the fate of 8 conspirators and, in many ways, establish precedents that would shape American security and justice for generations to come. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold were sentenced to death by hanging. The announcement of these verdicts sent shockwaves through the courtroom and across the nation. Never before had the United States executed a woman for a federal crime, and Mary Surratt's death sentence sparked immediate controversy that would persist long after the gallows claimed its victims. Dr. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael Oliphant received life sentences at hard labor, while Edmund Spangler, a Ford's Theater stagehand accused of aiding Booth's escape, was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. The variations in punishment reflected the commissioner's assessment of each defendant's level of culpability, but critics argued that the sentences were influenced more by public opinion and political considerations than by careful legal analysis. President Andrew Johnson faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his presidency when a petition for clemency arrived on his desk, signed by 5 of the 9 military commissioners, requesting that Mary Surratt's sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. The commissioners had included this recommendation with their original verdict, but Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt later claimed he had never shown Johnson this crucial document. Whether Johnson actually saw the clemency petition became a controversy that would haunt both men for the remainder of their lives. Johnson's decision to allow the executions to proceed reflected both his own harsh view of Confederate sympathizers and the overwhelming public demand for retribution. The president, himself a target of the assassination conspiracy, believed that showing mercy would be interpreted as weakness at a moment when the nation needed to demonstrate that crimes against its government would be punished with unwavering severity. On July 7th, 1865, at approximately 1:30 p.m., the 4 condemned conspirators were led from their cells to a hastily constructed gallows in the Arsenal's courtyard. Mary Surratt, dressed in black and supported by 2 soldiers, appeared near collapse as she climbed the scaffold steps. Lewis Powell maintained his characteristic stoicism, while George Atzerodt wept openly and David Harold trembled with terror as the nooses were placed around their necks. The execution was witnessed by a crowd of government officials, military personnel, and invited civilians, all gathered under the brutal July sun to witness what many hoped would be the final act in the Lincoln assassination tragedy. At precisely 1:26 p.m., the trapdoors opened simultaneously, and 4 lives ended in an instant that seemed to mark not just individual punishment, but America's collective attempt to achieve closure through retribution. But the executions, rather than ending the controversy, only intensified debates that would persist for decades. Mary Surratt's death particularly horrified many Americans who believed that executing a woman, regardless of her guilt, violated fundamental principles of chivalry and Christian mercy. Her last words, "I am innocent," echoed in the consciences of those who questioned whether the military tribunal had achieved justice or merely satisfied a nation's thirst for vengeance. The immediate aftermath of the assassination and trial transformed American presidential security forever. The casual accessibility that had characterized Lincoln's presidency, his habit of walking unguarded through Washington streets, his open-door policy at the White House, his attendance at public events without adequate protection, became historical artifacts that would never return. Future presidents would live behind walls of security that Lincoln would have found both necessary and deeply saddening. The Secret Service, originally created to combat counterfeiting, was formally assigned presidential protection duties, though this expansion would not occur until after James Garfield's assassination in 1881. The concept of the presidency as an institution requiring extraordinary security measures took root in the soil of Lincoln's martyrdom, fundamentally altering the relationship between American leaders and the people they served. The conspiracy trial also established troubling precedents for the use of military tribunals to prosecute civilians, precedents that would be invoked during subsequent national crises. The legal questions raised by the Lincoln conspirators' trial about due process, civilian versus military jurisdiction, and the balance between national security and individual rights would resurface during World War II, the Cold War, and the post-9/11 era, each time forcing Americans to grapple with the same fundamental tensions between security and liberty. John Wilkes Booth himself never lived to face trial. On April 26, 1865, federal troops had cornered him in a barn on Richard Garrett's farm in Virginia. When Booth refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire, and in the confusion that followed, Sergeant Boston Corbett shot the assassin, claiming later that God had directed him to pull the trigger. Booth died within hours, whispering his final words, "Tell my mother I died for my country." The manhunt's end brought no satisfaction to a grieving nation. Booth's death seemed almost anticlimactic after the drama of his crime and flight, and many Americans felt cheated of the opportunity to see Lincoln's assassin face proper justice. The actor who had craved center stage had exited the national drama before the final act, leaving questions and controversies that would never be fully resolved. The Lincoln assassination's impact on American political culture proved even more profound than its effect on security procedures. The martyred president became a secular saint in American civil religion, his death transforming him from a controversial wartime leader into an icon of national unity and moral purpose. The assassination elevated Lincoln's legacy above the partisan disputes of his presidency, creating the mythic figure who would inspire future generations of Americans facing their own crises of democracy and conscience. Perhaps most significantly, Lincoln's death changed how Americans understood the fragility of their democratic institutions. The assassination demonstrated that the American system of government, despite its strength and resilience, remained vulnerable to individual acts of fanatical violence. This recognition would shape American political development for generations, influencing everything from security protocols to constitutional interpretations to the very conception of presidential power. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The shot that John Wilkes Booth fired in Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, did more than end one man's life. It transformed an entire nation's understanding of leadership, security, justice, and the price of democracy. In the years that followed, Americans would continue to grapple with the questions raised by that terrible night. How do free societies protect their leaders without sacrificing their openness? How do nations seek justice without abandoning their principles? How do democracies heal from wounds that seem to threaten their very existence? The answers would evolve with each generation, but the questions themselves, born in the chaos of Ford's Theater and the grief of a nation, would remain eternally relevant to the American experiment in self-government.